This episode was recorded on the afternoon of Tuesday, May the 7th. Already in overcrowded, flimsy tents, people in Rafah, the last refuge for 1.5 million people, are facing threats from every direction. Soaring temperatures, dying from heat strokes and lack of clean water, not enough food, and now, the closure of the only lifeline for aid, while living under a cloud of an impending ground incursion by Israel, which has stationed its tanks on the peripheries of Rafah. After being forcibly displaced, Gazans are being asked to move again to another overcrowded area that Israel has labeled a so-called safe zone as the ground assault begins. Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu vows to continue with this, quote, limited scope offensive, regardless of whether or not a ceasefire agreement is reached between Israel and Hamas. So are there any safe zones in Gaza? And why did Israel target Rafah at such a sensitive time with regards to the ongoing talks? And how is all of this being seen inside of Israel and being reflected on the ground in Gaza? This is Beyond the Headlines, and I'm your host, Nada AlTaher. Today, I'm joined by two Israelis with somewhat different views on what their country has succeeded and failed at achieving in the war on Gaza and the plan there and in Rafah overall. Gershon Baskin is a political analyst and a former negotiator of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict and peace process. And Kobi Michael is a senior research fellow at the Institute for National Security Studies in Tel Aviv. So Kobi, we're trying to understand what happened with the ceasefire. Did Israel really reject the proposal that Hamas approved?
I think that officially it was rejected by the war cabinet, and there is, I would say, a broad consensus about that, because this is not considered as a yes of Hamas to the original proposal that was made by the Egyptians and the Americans. This is a new proposal that was made by Hamas, but an Israeli work team is supposed to be now in Egypt in order to look for any further options, if there is any opportunity to do something with that.
So Hamas accepted a deal that they kind of amended. Is that what you're saying?
Yes.
Okay.
I don't know that to be the truth. I think that there are different versions of what happened here, and I don't think that we have enough information yet to verify whether or not the paper that Hamas has issued, made public, is in fact the deal that the Egyptians put on the table or an amended deal by Hamas. The Israeli official story is that it's not the same deal that the Egyptians presented to them, but we haven't heard from the Egyptians yet, nor have we heard from the American CIA team either.
Have we seen anything problematic in the version of the deal that Hamas presented? Anything that stands out to any of you guys?
Yes, I think that at least as far as I'm familiar with the details as published in the Israeli media, it looks that the amended proposal of Hamas is a bit problematic for Israel, even more than a bit problematic, because first of all, they intend that the war will be ceased in the second phase of the deal. Secondly, there is, I would say, a problem with regard to the identity of the 33 hostages that will be released in the first phase. Israel meant that these will be live hostages. According to the amended proposal of Hamas, this might be a combination of dead and live hostages. And thirdly, the demand of Hamas that people will be allowed to go back to the northern part of the Gaza Strip without any restrictions, something that is problematic from the Israeli point of view, because we know that there will be some Hamas and even many Hamas operatives that will use the opportunity in order to go back to the northern part of the Gaza Strip. And the fourth thing which is problematic is the idea that Hamas will get some international guarantees that Israel will not be allowed to resume the war under any conditions after the third phase, even after the second phase, not the third phase. If Israel will be willing to accept such an obligation, it will be only after the accomplishment of the third phase, not the second phase. So in order to summarize, I think that Israel perceives the proposal or the amended proposal of Hamas as sort of manipulation, try to steal some time because they believe that the time works in favor of them.
And can I comment on what I think the problem with the deal?
Mm-hmm.
The main problem is that with the absence of any kind of political endgame by the Israelis of replacing Hamas with an alternative, more acceptable and legitimate Palestinian leadership, any deal with Hamas leaves Hamas in control of Gaza at the end of whatever the deal is. Any requirement of Israel to release all the hostages without having a political endgame that replaces Hamas, it brings Israel to the point where it fails totally to achieve its war goals. And this is the major problem with the deal. The other things that Kobi mentioned, in my view, are much less important details. It doesn't matter if the first 33 hostages are alive or dead. There are 132 hostages in Gaza that have to be brought home. Israel should be negotiating for all 132 of them, live or dead. The sequencing of who comes home when is much less important. Israel has the alternative playing card in the negotiation on the release of prisoners, and Israel is going to be releasing a huge number of Palestinian prisoners here. And again, the major problem is with the absence of a political endgame. If we're looking at winners and losers, first of all, there are no winners in this war. We've both lost in this war. But in the negotiations at the end of the war, Hamas wins. Israel has given a victory to Hamas in this deal, and it didn't have to. There are political alternatives that are not being pursued simply because the strategy developed by Benjamin Netanyahu since 2009 of ensuring that there will never be a Palestinian state next to Israel is what brought us to October 7th and has played continually since October 7th and led us to this point.
I wanted to ask regarding where we are at right now, the decision to invade Rafah at a time when talks are at a very sensitive point. The question, is an invasion of Rafah a nail in the coffin of any talks? And how could Israel possibly give 100,000 Gazans, if not more, because other people will surely be making plans to be forcibly displaced from Rafah? Once they hear that an invasion is impending, how can Israel give 100,000 Gazans plus 24 hours or less to leave everything where they have already been displaced before and head to Mawasi or other places? And as we've seen since the beginning of the war, several times over, safe zones are not safe. People are either killed inside those safe zones or on the way there. If any one of you wants to please answer my question.
Yes, first of all, I would like to agree with Gershon with regard to the outcome of this war. If Hamas will remain as the sovereign power in the Gaza Strip, this will be an Israeli failure. And this will be a sort of an ultimate victory of Hamas. And therefore, I think that Israel must come with a sort of an idea or a political vision with regard to the replacement of Hamas in the Gaza Strip. I'm not sure that until here, we are under full agreement, Gershon and me. I'm not sure that we are agree about what should be the replacement of Hamas in the Gaza Strip. But with regard to your question, first of all, at least according to my knowledge, something around 65,000 people already evacuated themselves from the eastern part of Rafah. And this is almost 2/3 of the number that the IDF set, which is 100,000. And it was in less than 24 hours.
But that doesn't mean that they have gone to somewhere safe or that they have safely evacuated or that they will be in a place where they have full provisions of services such as food, water, and
We can discuss it. I think that they have the option for reaching safe zones. But as we talked yesterday, the modus operandi that the IDF uses is the idea of dividing the entire region of Rafah to small polygons. Okay, and the IDF does not intend to invade Rafah in its entire at once. It will be done step by step, and people will be asked to evacuate themselves from very specific polygons. And I think that the IDF went through a very impressive learning curve during the last 7 months, and it does the utmost efforts in order to minimize the collateral damage. This is not an interest of Israel to increase the number of the civilian casualties. On the contrary. And for the time being, we are concentrating on the eastern part of Rafah and on Philadelphia corridor. Those areas are not too populated. And I think that the IDF does not intend to attack Rafah, as I said, in a whole and at once. Secondly, I'm not sure that Israel really intends to continue the operation in Rafah. I think that what we see now is another trial of Israel to create a sort of a leverage on Hamas leadership in order to make Hamas leadership more flexible with regard to the negotiation. And I think that Israel still prefers a successful hostage deal on ground operation in Rafah.
Gershon, would you agree with that?
I think that where I agree with Kobi is that I'm not sure that Israel intends to invade all of Rafah. The reality is that between Khan Yunis and Rafah, which is 20% of the Gaza Strip, there are 1.5 million Palestinians, most of them displaced. Any genuine Israeli attack on Rafah, even if done by polygons, as Kobi said, would be catastrophic. There's no way of avoiding civilian casualties, and as we know, the majority of people there are children and women, and any attack there is going to result in high numbers of civilian casualties. I'm not sure that the attack last night by Israel was the beginning of an incursion into Rafah. It might have been one of two things, and it's probably two things. One is a response to the attack of rockets and mortars by Hamas from a humanitarian zone in Rafah into Israel, killing 4 Israeli soldiers and wounding 9 others, several of them in critical condition. This was something that Israel had to respond to, particularly because it was coming from a humanitarian zone in Rafah. And it's clear from what we know this morning that Israel intended to capture the Palestinian side of the Rafah crossing. This is part of a larger Israeli plan to deal with the Philadelphia corridor, the 13-kilometer border between Gaza and Egypt, where it's very clear has been a route for smuggling weapons, bombs, rockets, ammunition for many years now. I believe that this is a mistake by Israel. I think the Philadelphia corridor must be dealt with, but I think it really has to be dealt with by Egypt. And I think that the United States should be intervening here and providing Egypt with the finance, the know-how. The U.S. Army Corps of Engineers should be there supervising, ensuring that the Rafah crossing and the Philadelphia corridor are no longer ever a route for smuggling anything into Gaza, not cigarettes and not rockets. And that has to be done. That has to be part of the Israeli war effort. It should be common with the Egyptians and the Americans. And I think it can be done on the Egyptian side of the border, not on the Palestinian side of the border. I think, unfortunately, I think that part of what's being done in Rafah today is intended by Netanyahu and members of his government to sabotage the negotiations with Hamas on the hostage deal, because Hamas's red line has been since day one that any deal that will return all the hostages to Israel must include the end of the war. This is something that Hamas has not budged to. What I was told last night by someone in Hamas, and I heard another Hamas spokesperson, Zafir Jabarin, who's the person who replaced Salah Haruri, gave an interview last night in which he said they have received guarantees from the United States that if they enter into a temporary ceasefire, it would become permanent. And this is what Hamas intends to see happening or wants to see happening. Again, our problem is not that the war will end, but the war will end with Hamas still in place in Gaza. This is our problem.
But as you said, Israel has not presented a proper way to fill that vacuum.
And this is just another reason of how our prime minister and our government works against the interest of our country and our people.
So I want to ask, based on that kind of answer, I wanted to ask both of you, do you think that Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu is prolonging the war for his own interests? Kobi, can you answer first, and then Gershon?
I think that we lost the balance between the political and the personal calculations and the strategic calculations. Look, there are always, even during wars, political calculations, okay? We are dealing with politics. We are dealing with politicians. They have political agenda, and it's very natural and it's very reasonable that they will have a political agenda and they intend and want to survive politically. I'm not surprised of that, and I don't criticize Netanyahu for having political calculation or considerations. The problem is that the leader in the national level must be able to make the right balance between the political considerations and the strategic considerations. And here, I'm not sure that we are succeeding in creating the right balance. I think that we are losing the right balance between the political and the strategic calculations.
I'll be more emphatic about it. Netanyahu, before October 7th, presented himself as the greatest leader of the Jewish people since Moses. And after October 7th, there is no question that Netanyahu will go down in history as the worst leader that the Jewish people have ever had. Any normal democratic country, the person who was responsible on the day of the single largest tragedy to its people, for the Jewish people, the biggest traumatic event since the Holocaust, should have taken responsibility on that day and resigned in shame. And Netanyahu continues to hold on. And I believe that everything that motivates him is staying in power and relieving himself of any responsibility for the failures that he has brought upon this country since he came into power in 2009. I think this is a defamation of what this country is and what it stands for, and Netanyahu is personally responsible for it.
Would you say that militarily and from a humanitarian perspective, it is wise, ethical, correct, justified, defensible that Israel would enter Rafah right now, at this time, not just from a political perspective with the negotiations in the background, but from a tactical, logistical, humanitarian perspective?
I think Nada, that Israel should have coordinated with Egypt and entered into Rafah on the first day of the war, not at the end of the war. The Rafah corridor should have been taken care of in the very first weeks of the war without the need to excessively bomb the civilian population. A coordinated effort with Egypt after the atrocities committed by Hamas would have been acceptable to Egypt. It would have been done in a coordinated way with Egypt. It would have been accepted in the Arab world as something that needed to be done. Likewise, Israel should have been coordinating with its other Arab allies. If we had any political horizon in which we were willing to deal constructively with the Palestinian issue, it would have not been necessary to kill 45,000 people in Gaza to achieve the aims of replacing Hamas in Gaza. And everything that Israel has done in this war, with the amazing achievements of an army that has not been trained in the last 2 decades to be a defense force, it has been an occupation police force. The Israeli army has achieved remarkable results as an army, but nonetheless, the strategy of this war has been a failed strategy since day one.
Kobi, anything to say?
First of all, I do not accept the number of more than 40,000 casualties. I would
30,000.
like to remind
20,000.
and I would like to remind that at least 1/3, if not 1/2 of them, are Hamas and Palestinian Islamic Jihad terrorists and not civilians. But anyway, with regard to your question, there is a reason for a military attack in Rafah. And a military attack or a military operation in Rafah can be realized in a very responsible manner. Even it doesn't mean that there will be no casualties, but it can be done. But if such a military operation is conducted without any political objective and without any, I would say, vision or idea about the replacement of Hamas or an alternative to Hamas in the Gaza Strip, I think that there are some difficulties in justifying such an operation. If Israel will be able to reach to an understanding with the regional powers backed by the United States about an alternative to Hamas, a replacement to Hamas in the Gaza Strip, then there is, I would say, a need, and even a crucial need, to eliminate the rest or the left capacities, military capacities of Hamas in Rafah in order to prevent Hamas from recovering itself, but in the very same time to replace Hamas and to put on the ground the alternative to Hamas. Otherwise, we will remain with 2 options and two only. The first one is to remain the occupier of the Gaza Strip, okay, for a long period of time until there will be another alternative, or to withdraw, and then we will enable Hamas to recover itself, and we will find ourselves in a very perpetuating war of attrition in the Gaza Strip.
Last question for you both. What will it take for Israel to withdraw from Gaza and declare a military victory? Would it be killing Abu Ubaidah? Would it be killing Hamas's leadership? And would you agree with the notion that Hamas as an ideology cannot be killed when there are generations of children who have lost fathers and brothers and mothers, and so will always see Israel as an aggressor.
I think that the only way we can change the future with regard to Gaza and the Palestinian people in general is for Palestinians to understand that they have a reason for hope, for freedom, liberation, and dignity. An Israeli occupation of Gaza is the surest way to build Hamas and groups more extreme than Hamas. If we just look back, Hamas has recruited its Nukhba forces from bereaved families in Gaza since 2008. After every battle with Israel, Hamas, Qassam organization went from house to house of bereaved families and people who lost their homes and recruited their children and educated them, indoctrinated them in a distorted view of Islam, where the supreme commandment of their religion is to become a martyr, a shaheed for Palestine, for Allah, for Al-Aqsa, and you will be given the chance of revenge. If we want to change that, and we have tens of thousands of new orphans in Gaza as a result of the war. If we want to change this, we need to understand that Palestinians have to have a reason for hope, that they will achieve independence, freedom, and dignity. Israel needs to understand that it will never have security if Palestinians don't have freedom, independence, and dignity. Palestinians need to understand that they will never have freedom, independence, and dignity if Israel does not have security. This is the equation here that we have between these two people. We've been killing each other for more than 100 years. It will take the young generation to begin to understand that they have to look forward and not only backwards, as we've done for all too long on both sides of this conflict. We have a lot of work to do to achieve it. The first thing that we need to do, all of us, is to get rid of our leaders and have new leaders. The Palestinians need new leadership. The Israelis need new leadership. We need the help of the world to understand that this conflict is not remaining within the boundaries of the river and the sea. It has gone beyond. It is no longer a conflict which needs to be resolved first and foremost by the people living here, because it endangers the security of the region and the world. And therefore, there's a responsibility of our neighbors and the international community to help us. And this is where we have to lead to. But the first thing we have to do is understand no Netanyahu, no Abbas, no Hamas. We need new leaders here to lead us forward.
Kobi?
I think that we have to distinguish between the ideology of Hamas, something which is deeply rooted in the minds and the hearts of the people, and this is something that you cannot uproot by using kinetic means. We have to distinguish between the ideology and between the military and governmental capacities of Hamas. This war is concentrated, at least according to the objectives as declared by the war cabinet, this war is concentrated on the military and governmental capacities of Hamas. And the idea of dismantling Hamas is not the idea of reaching to the last terrorist or to the last RPG. The idea is to dismantle the major or the main centers of gravity of the military and governmental capacities of Hamas in the entire Gaza Strip in a way that will assure that Hamas will not be able, first, to recover itself, secondly, to become once again a security threat to Israel, and thirdly, to assure that Hamas will not remain the sovereign power in the Gaza Strip. And as long as it is connected to or related to Hamas, I do not believe that there is any option to reach to any sort of understanding with Hamas with regard to any peaceful agreement here in the region. We have to listen carefully to things that have been said by Hamas leaders before October 7th and repeatedly after October 7th. We have to remember that Hamas is not only a Palestinian national movement. First of all, Hamas is a religious movement. This is the Palestinian branch of the Muslim Brotherhood. They are deeply committed to the religious vision of the re-establishment of the Islamic Caliphate, and there is no place to negotiate with Hamas, and Hamas must be dismantled as a sovereign power in the Gaza Strip. On the other hand, I think that, as Gershon said, The Palestinian Authority and the current Palestinian leadership is also a very problematic address. This is, I would say, a Palestinian Authority that was not able during the last 3 decades to concentrate on building their independence, their independent state, their state institutions, civil society, economy, or infrastructures. They were more interested in sabotaging the Zionist project. Unfortunately, this was a historical failure of Arafat and later on Abu Mazen, that they have not succeeded in making the transformation process from a militant revolutionary national movement, the PLO, to nation builders, the Palestinian Authority. And they actually duplicated the political DNA of the PLO to the Palestinian Authority. And in the very same time, I do agree that we don't have the right leadership here in Israel that is able to create the required consensus among the Israeli public with regard to the alternatives. And unfortunately, October 7th actually deepened dramatically the gaps and the mistrust between the Israeli public and the Palestinian public. And I think that it will be very difficult to any new leadership in Israel to reconvince the Israeli constituency, the Israeli public, about the idea of two-state solution. I think that we have to think maybe in other terms, to think about some other creative paradigms that are related to the regional architecture that will provide both sides with some new opportunities, because by creating or establishing the new regional architecture, we will be able to enlarge the pie and to create opportunities that do not exist now in the bilateral level between the Israelis and the Palestinians.
Now, I just add that I want to agree with Kobi that we need to confront the Palestinian issue within a regional context. We need a regional architecture for stability, security, and economic development. But the absence of a Palestinian independent state within that architecture makes the building collapse. And this is a reality that we need to understand. I agree that the gaps between Israel and Palestine have grown since October 7th. It will be more difficult to bridge those gaps before. And I think it's incumbent on the Palestinians to demonstrate a new leadership which is genuinely committed to making peace with Israel. I think the process has to begin with the issue of education, not as an afterthought as it was in Oslo, but a building stone for a new reality in the Middle East, which will be a commitment of Israelis and Palestinians to examine what we teach our children about each other, because education is a reflection of what we really believe. It's what we pass on to our children. And I think all this is possible. I know that there are voices within the Palestinian world who are re-examining their struggle and understand after October 7th and so everything that's happened since, that there is no longer any armed struggle option for the Palestinian people. Even those who think it might be legitimate are saying the lesson that we have learned from this war is that we have no armed struggle and we have to reinvigorate the vision of a two-state solution. But it's not a bilateral solution. I agree totally with Kobi. It has to be in a regional context. It should not be American-led. It must be born and bred and developed through the region. We need American support and European support and others, but this really has to be a regional project.
Gershon and Kobi, thank you for joining me. Every day, the situation in Rafah continues to change. After Hamas announced that it's accepting the ceasefire proposal, Gazans began celebrating, one moment, then burying their loved ones the next, after Israel began its strikes. This episode of Beyond the Headlines was produced by Arthur Edison and Dua Farid, and I'm your host, Nada AlTaher. To stay updated on the situation in Gaza, follow thenationalnews.com and subscribe to Beyond the Headlines wherever you get your podcasts.